can you bring us up to date with this Nord Stream revelation, I guess, the reports that have come out in Germany? What have you learned?
Well, the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines connecting Russia with the northeast coast of Germany were almost entirely disabled by a series of explosions at the bottom of the Baltic Sea near the Danish island of Bornholm in September 2022. And for the best part of 2 years, there has been very little official information about the theories on what might have happened. And in that vacuum, there has been a profusion of speculation, pointing the finger variously at the US or Russia or Ukraine or even Poland or the UK. And over time, the Swedish and the Danish authorities have wrapped up their investigations without sort of publishing any official conclusions about who might have done it. So the only one that's left going still is the German investigation. And leaks out of that have been suggesting for some time now that they believe the operation was carried out by a crew of about half a dozen Ukrainians operating off a hired luxury yacht from the German port of Rostock. What has now happened is that it has emerged that they compiled enough evidence to get an arrest warrant issued for a Ukrainian citizen identified only as Volodymyr Z, who had been based in Poland. And they are also said to have identified two further suspects, both Ukrainian nationals, that they believe were the divers on this yacht who planted the explosives.
It's quite the development, isn't it? And I guess it raises an awful lot of questions. The first being, in my mind, what's the crime here? And the reason I ask that is because it feels to me, or it felt to me at the time, I guess, that this was, whoever did it, a sort of act of sabotage on Ukraine's behalf against the aggressor in a war. And yes, the fact was that then impacted mainland Europe, of course. But why is that not a legitimate act of war to damage a Russian asset in that way?
Well, this is exactly the dilemma that the German government will be faced with if it does indeed turn out that they believe that this act of sabotage was carried out, at least with the approval or knowledge of the Ukrainian authorities, which they haven't said yet. So it's still possible, and certainly the Polish government, for example, has not given up on this theory that it's all been a kind of elaborate ruse laid down by Russian intelligence to disguise what was really a kind of covert Russian operation. The answer to the question in a legal sense is that this is a piece of multinational infrastructure in international waters that had been largely paid for by Gazprom, the Russian state-owned energy, primarily gas conglomerate, but had also been funded by half a dozen European energy companies, including Shell. So the idea that you could simply sabotage a piece of infrastructure in international waters is pretty problematic. It's not in the same legal, moral, or political sphere, for example, as Ukrainian acts of sabotage on Russian soil, as we've seen recently.
You mentioned the name that has been released, Volodymyr Z. Very clever, potentially, I guess, and obviously does raise questions about what, if anything, Mr. Zelensky knew.
It does. There have been reports based on apparent briefings from the German investigation that the mastermind is suspected to have been a colonel in the Ukrainian SBU military intelligence agency called Roman Chervinsky. The Ukrainian government has repeatedly insisted that it had nothing to do with the sabotage. It remains totally possible. Well, there are basically three possibilities. Number one, the Ukrainian government's lying. Or number two, this was a false flag operation, a kind of red herring trail laid by the Russians to disguise their own sabotage operation. Number three, this was carried out by a Ukrainian network, but without the knowledge of at least the central government in Ukraine or the kind of upper echelons of the military intelligence service.
Does this feel like a criminal case where you could ever come up with an outcome that is, beyond all reasonable doubt, I guess is the phrase we use in the UK at least, isn't it? Given the potential for that sort of Russian self-sabotage, as it were, that you've mentioned, it would be very difficult to prove that this was a group of 6 Ukrainians, wouldn't it? When there is that doubt about what Russia is capable of.
On the basis of the evidence that is so far in the public domain, a lot of experts have been very skeptical that 6 people on what is essentially a pleasure yacht could have managed an operation that involves diving down to 3 separate locations at a depth of about 80 to 90 meters at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, planting the equivalent in each case of about half a ton of TNT, and then setting it off a little bit over a week later. There were certainly a lot of Russian naval activities detected around the same areas in the weeks and months before the attack. So really, we are now waiting to see what evidence the German prosecutors will bring to light to justify their claims, if this ever does reach a court of law. And the other point that needs to be emphasized here is that despite the arrest warrant having been issued, that was at the start of June. The 60-day remit is now up. The individual, this Volodymyr Z, appears to have been tipped off somehow, or got wind of it at least, and fled Poland, where he was previously based. It's possible that he will not be extradited to Germany, and this may never come to trial. So we may never actually see the evidence tested in the court of law.
Whether it comes to trial or not, I would imagine it was a difficult call for Germany to make this public, would it be? Because, the relations with a nation that is under attack, that is under threat, are all important. And that includes, the public perception of those relations.
Yeah, it's very, very awkward for the German authorities. They have conflicting imperatives, right? On the one hand, they are carrying out a very serious criminal investigation in which the rule of law is paramount and justice has to be done from the perspective of the Federal Prosecutor's Office and the Federal Criminal Police Office. However, from a kind of diplomatic and political perspective for the government in Berlin, it's a very different set of questions about how much of a stink they want to kick up if these suspicions are indeed confirmed, or if any kind of incontrovertible link can be established to the kind of upper realms of the Ukrainian government. And throughout all this, the question has been, how do we conduct this very delicate, highly politically sensitive and complicated investigation without leaving people so completely in the dark that you get all these crazy theories about how it was secretly MI6 or the CIA or whatever. And the solution they appear to have found has been to kind of issue clandestine briefings to a select group of German journalists, which is how this information has been leaking out, which does make it very difficult to verify. But this appears to be the kind of workaround that the German authorities have devised to solve that problem.
Do you think it has or will affect Western relations with Ukraine at what is an unbelievably delicate time?
Well, the key question in terms of the relationship with Ukraine is whether, first of all, whether this comes to trial, and secondly, whether a link can be proven to Zelensky's administration. And if the Zelensky administration can plausibly deny that it knew what was going on, then it's not going to present itself in diplomatic terms as a serious issue to be overcome. If that problem does come up, then it's very hard to know what Germany's diplomatic response would be. But based on the way we've seen Germany respond, for example, to the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk province of Russia, they have been very forgiving. They can't give Ukraine a blank check to do whatever it wants in terms of the war with Russia. They have to sort of formally maintain that there are red lines and that they oppose escalation. And yet, I would be very surprised if they choose to make a big song and dance about it in terms of their relationship with Kiev.
That being said, and there's going to be a lot of weight on the word if in this question, if they were able to provide sort of incontrovertible evidence that Zelensky's administration knew and perhaps even gave permission for this to happen, I mean, that's potentially end of Zelensky territory, isn't it?
I'm not entirely sure that it would be the end of President Zelensky. I'm not at all an expert on Ukrainian politics, but I mean,
but what I
it's
mean
not
is it
just
would be
one
difficult
big
for the
if,
West to continue giving support for an act that had been proven in a democratic country as a criminal act with his support.
Well, again, it all depends on the kind of chain of command and whether it can be proven that his office knew what had happened and had approved of what had happened. And again, we have to bear in mind that this is in the context of the early months of a existential defensive war, and it's fundamentally a political, a diplomatic question on that level. And it's impossible to know what the consequences would be for Zelensky, but I expect if all of those ifs were to materialize, that NATO would still be pretty mindful of the extenuating circumstances and inclined to give Zelensky an easy ride, purely for geopolitical reasons, if nothing else. But that's pure speculation.
Yes, of course. And just finally, whatever the outcome of this, the fact that these reports have come out, they're being made public, I would imagine this plays, from a propaganda point of view, straight into Vladimir Putin's hands, right? This is damaging to Ukraine in that sense, at the very, very least.
It's an interesting one because once you have destabilized people's perceptions of the truth and polarized the evaluation of evidence to the point where people are effectively existing in separate informational realms, there are still a lot of people on the Western side who are extremely skeptical of the idea that the Ukrainian government could have known of or sanctioned this operation, or indeed that it was kind of primarily a Ukrainian operation in the first place. So in terms of the kind of propaganda efficacy of this development from the Russian side, yes, they can instrumentalize it, and they will instrumentalize it against Ukraine in the international forum of public opinion. The extent to which they will kind of really manage to shift the public dialogue in Europe or in America or in the kind of multi-aligned countries that have been in between Russia and the West on this war is pretty hard to determine at this stage.